Okay, 30 seconds. Everything is set up, right?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Next is Michał Malewicz. I think he was one of the first YouTube influencers to comment on Penpot's open source nature, but also the ethics behind the privacy policy at Penpot. It was a video back in 2020 or 2021, right? So we've known him for a while now. And he comes to talk about the future of design and its multiple angles. Thank you very much, Michał.
All right. All right. Hey, welcome. It's 30 degrees, and I'm wearing a hoodie, which basically means I'm a slave to branding. But let's get this started. I'm going to talk about the future of UI design in particular, and mostly around, oh, not this, for some reason. All right, yeah. It's a different laptop. OK, yeah, we're back. Perfect. So we're going to talk about design trends and design styles and where I think they might be headed. So yeah, hey, my name is Michał, and I'm a professional skateboarder. Oh, sorry, that's a different conference next week. I'm a designer, and I've been a designer for 24 years. And over that course, I made over 500 different projects. And it's been a crazy ride, and I was able to experience it from the very beginning. In my company, we were fortunate to work for some of the biggest brands in the world, and also literally hundreds of startups by now. And I'm very curious as a person, as a designer. So that led me to basically outline or create a couple of design trends and methods, things like Newmorphism, Glassmorphism, the red square method, type framing, and hierarchy strips. And I do this because when I notice some things, I just can't stand to just sit idly and let things happen, so I just kind of intervene. But here we are, 2023. So to try and predict the future, we must first understand the past. So I'm going to share my own perspective with you, because that's going to tell you a little bit about how I approach this thing, how I look at design trends, and how I understand them. So I got my first computer in 1991. It was some old Atari computer, and I was drawn to it instantly. And I was a big fan of user interfaces, but these were the kinds of interfaces that I liked the most back then. And if you remember this game, you should probably do regular doctor checkups. But then in '97, something happened. I started playing Quake, a multiplayer video game, and I played it over a modem, so the phone bills were really, really horrible. My mom wasn't happy about them. But that led me to forming a team in Quake, and then my teammate said, we need a website. And it was '97, so like, how do you make a website? Well, the only way to make a website back then, there was no YouTube, no tutorials, was to take an existing website and try to hack it and change some parts of the HTML and see what happens. So this is what I did. This is a website I did in, I think, '98. And just for context, this is how Apple's website looked back then. And you probably noticed these little 3D style borders in the tables that they used. Those were super hot. Like, really, right now it looks laughable, looks old school, but these were like achieving stuff like that was the pinnacle. And making that particular website led me to also understand constraints, because all of the websites back then were tables. And if you remember TR and TD and stuff like that, these were the first design constraints that we had to face. So I was doing freelancing for a while, and then in 2001, I got my first industry job. And this is how I imagined myself while accepting the offer. But in reality, it was a 3-story building overlooking a bus stop. So not quite like that. But to all those looking for a job right now in this difficult market, let me just say this. In 2001, I was the only one that showed up to the interview. So basically, they had to hire me. But the good thing about it was that we started working with Flash in that new company very quickly. And if you remember Macromedia, it used to be an industry darling that was acquired and killed. But to me, Flash was like my favorite time to be a designer because you could practically do everything you wanted. And this is an example, very low fidelity because I don't have good quality screenshots from that time. But this is an example of a website we did for Nestle back in like 2004 or 5, where they had an entire island to explore, look for Easter eggs, play games, and compete and win prizes. Everything was animated, alive, and it was like a delightful experience. And then around 2007, things changed into the touch-based interfaces. So obviously, I had to jump into that skeuomorphic style design, including working on some pretty obscure now devices and making apps for them in that style. Wood was also really popular back then, and both as backgrounds and as backgrounds under the mockups. And an interesting thing about it was that even when skeuomorphism was on the way out, this app on the right was a loyalty app for the Irish market, and we did a case study or like a research where we asked the users whether they prefer a wooden background in the app or they prefer the minimal one that everybody was so obsessed about back then. And 80% of the people said they want the wood because it looks like the groceries are already on their kitchen table. So the users weren't really happy about all the minimal stuff. And we also did a couple of mixes, so trying to mix those skeuomorphic elements with some traditional flatter designs. And just look at those icons. There was a beautiful time in interfaces, overkill, complete sensory overload. If you look at the home screen, you just have to process so much information, but that was just works of art. And then things changed again. The world started going flat first with Windows Phone, which was a very interesting choice, even though it didn't survive, and then iOS 7. And that leads us to an interesting revolution, because back then we used to do everything in Photoshop, work on pixels, and I worked with a very senior designer back then who was doing wireframing and basically not that visual stuff that's for babies. And he initially never touched the visuals. Like, he didn't know how to do the shadows, the highlights, the textures. And once the vector tools came along, he started doing UI because this revolution spawned a new wave of design tools that you can easily use, a little bit like PowerPoint. Just drag and drop some shapes, rearrange them, and play around. And it opened design to a lot more people. You don't need those typical graphics design skills. You don't need texturing, lighting. You can just do it a lot easier. And then material design came along, and it was the big day for design systems, obviously. There were other design systems before, but this was the first one that kind of popularized the whole thing among designers. And that leads me to today, because I think this was around that time where design started to get a little bit boring. And if you looked at material apps from the very beginning, they kind of looked all the same. And obviously, it was just a business-driven decision. Like, how can we save money? Like, let's use templates, let's use something easy to code, easily repeatable, and just business was pushing it. Because design should be primarily functional. Everybody says that it should work, and then it can look good, doesn't have to be beautiful. If it's clear, readable, and does the job, then it's fine. But we seem to have lost a little bit of the delight that I remember from the early days. And Jacob's law contributed to that because all the safe patterns were established, so nobody tried to experiment anymore. And all those systems pushed it out a little bit in favor of things that are cheaper to make. So obviously, the business loved it. Users, well, I think consciously didn't really care, but there were examples of apps that pushed a little bit further, did that delight with like a lot of extra effort, and got a couple million users because of that experience. But what about designers? So in 2019, I started looking around the design styles of that time and looked at them in a way, starting with the old skeuomorphism, going through flat design, the modern one, which was a little bit like material, all the way to new skeuomorphism. And if you look at them side by side, and this is basically the length of things that I go to, so I imagine how a flat app would look like if you turn it around and remove the glass from the phone and kind of stretch it out to layers. Skeuomorphism would be basically things kind of protruding from the background. Flat design would be things baked into the background. Material was just flat floating layers. And then the modern minimal was a little bit of both. And it was boring like that. Skeuomorphism was considered in bad taste, basically, until in November, a guy named Alexander uploaded this shot to Dribble. And it has a lot of problems. It's not really a design people should follow, let's say, but it sparked a lot of discussion. So I decided to give it a name. I called it Newmorphism because it was like a mix of flat design and skeuomorphism. That was something new, something to explore. And I wrote that very first article about it. I tried to outline all the good things about it, all the bad things about it. And obviously, a lot of people screamed accessibility from the very beginning. There were like at least 50 articles right after mine saying, oh, this is a horrible trend because it's not accessible. And sure, but any trend can be non-accessible if you apply it to everything, if you apply it to every button, every toggle, every element. But if you look at this example behind that screaming lady here, once you start removing the non-accessible elements, if all that other stuff is still visible, readable, and you understand the structure from it, then it's going to be just fine. So then after that, I started noticing the glass components everywhere and realized that everybody had a different name for it. Apple called it initially Aqua, then Vista Aero for Microsoft, then Frosted Glass from iOS 7, acrylic. And yeah, to me, things like that cannot happen. Like I can't have 4 different or 5 different names for the same thing. So I called it glassmorphism to make it a little bit easier for junior designers to learn that trend, to explore it, to try and maybe push it to some new directions. Okay, but we had minimalism since 2013, since iOS 7. It was pushed really strongly. It was made easier to do with all those new design tools. But I started to realize that UI was getting a little bit boring, a little bit repetitive. And the businesses liked it, but as designers, we kind of really wanted to be pushed maybe outside of some of those comfort zones. So if you look at it this way, you can have an easy, prefabricated, templatized design on one side that's going to be perfect for most use cases. And then you can have a work of art that's impossible to do, takes, well, I don't know, 40, 50 years or something. But is there a middle ground? Is there some place where we could meet in between and create something that maybe is mostly prefab, but has a little bit of that soul, that spark? And I have to start by saying that not all products need it. So it's not like, oh, our product is made with a design system, so we don't need to do anything, just add some delight or stuff. We've done an app for, vending machine technicians. So obviously, if a guy needs to fix a vending machine, he needs the data to be clear, readable, and everything. So I don't think he needs delight in that particular scenario. So in many cases, sure, it's not necessary, it's not needed. But there is a lot of consumer-facing products that are seriously missing this right now. And delight also helps with the emotional connection. A good example of this is the Sleepiest app by Cuberto, which is a sleep tracker or like an app that helps you fall asleep better. And they put so much love and attention into that app that basically got like 3 or 4 million users. And that shows that sometimes in some of these scenarios, when you add the little heart, the little soul to the design, it can help sell more. So I was really surprised in a good way where Airbnb started doing stuff like this. And this was controversial. A lot of designers were really angry, like, how can you do stuff like that in 2023? This is old school, this is silly, how do you code it? Probably months of coding. But I think this is great news because when a big company starts doing these things, then a lot of other people notice. They notice that, oh, they were bold enough to try something. But that's not all, because Airbnb did a couple of things like that. They have a pretty minimal overall style and aesthetic, But if you look at how those little cards with the hosts behave as you scroll, they open as you scroll them, and when you tap on them, they kind of fold out towards you, so look a little bit like a book. But then the rest of the interface is pretty minimal. It's like what you would expect from an app right now, which is white backgrounds, simple iconography, simple fonts, pretty good white space. Everything works here, but these little things, or this could have been just a segmented control, or maybe some stock photo illustration changing on the top. You know, that popular style that everybody uses right now with the isometry, but kind of done from that very same set that's free. Yeah, but they tried something different here. They tried something a little bit more interesting, memorable, and just this little part, even with the little seagulls flying through the scene at the very beginning, this adds to the experience without really taking away from the functionality, because it's still a minimal, good-looking app. So I would call this unnecessary but awesome. And it's controversial mostly among designers. I asked some regular users, and of course their primary objective is to book a room or a place as cheaply as possible and as best as possible. But these things add, and a lot of people did notice that. So now we're here with Apple announcing a, let's say, new in their own words category, because obviously it's not new either. But the fact that they are pushing it towards the mainstream actually creates a whole new playground for designers, because Jacob's law doesn't really apply very strongly to this yet. There are some patterns, there are some principles, some guidelines, but you can still experiment. You can still try completely crazy things, and even they encourage you to. So this is, one more time, this little window of opportunity for designers to try something crazy and see what happens. And I'm definitely going to be building things for this myself. So I would say that if you're a designer right now, even if you're not interested in VR, AR, and all that stuff, just play around with this, because this can give you some ideas on what you can do in regular interfaces. Because if we were playing it safe and just kind of using what we know every time, then all the apps would still have a refresh button, because that didn't come from any big company or any big OS. It came from Twitter designers that basically created pull to refresh, and it took the world by storm. But if they didn't experiment, if they were trying to keep the status quo and just keep it simple to build, prefabricated, then we wouldn't have that. So what I think the UI is going to be going forward is it's going to stay pretty minimal. It's going to be mostly those systemic approaches. It's going to be mostly clear, readable, without too many decorations. But some apps will and should be adding a pinch of skeuomorphism, so not like completely skeuomorphic, but just a tiny bit. Kind of like Airbnb did. Like, they have 95% of the app is basically standard, what you would expect. And then those little things on top of that, minimalism, just kind of push the experience towards something memorable. Like, oh, I remember this app now because it doesn't look like all the 5 or 10 other booking services. Then the next thing is going to be material exploration. And by material, I mean, right now we're using just floating flat panels that don't have any representation in the real world. But we can explore some different types of glass morphism as well. There is some styles that I'm trying to kind of look around as well right now. And as an experiment, I'm going to be making a couple of case studies this year where I'm going to design from the ground up and then code and build a completely skeuomorphic app with a wooden background, just to prove that it can be still looking good and be usable, and actually take a lot of those principles from modern design into account as well, possibly some glass on it as well. I'm going to make a Newmorphic app and a couple of other styles just to see how we can kind of go a little bit outside of the norm. So hopefully it's going to be something worth checking out. And the last thing is something that is a great example from Sleepyst, as I mentioned before, which is delightful interactions. And by delightful interactions, I don't mean parallax scrolling. because that's basically, yeah, it looks nice, but everybody does that. So what I mean is like 3D transformations or something crazy, something that probably will take a month to code just for that little thing. So something expensive, something the business won't like, but something that the users will remember. And these things are something that I notice in apps. I take screenshots obsessively of stuff like that. But if you want to play it safe, if you want to just add a little bit of something different, here is an example of an app that we made recently for a client. And it's a pretty standard. It's blurring as you scroll. Many apps do that. But we picked a very weird font for the headings there. And this is like, if you just want to play it completely safe, cheap, small edition, pick a funky font for a little bit of the interface. Of course, it has to fit the style of the product, so it can't be random. Probably not Comic Sans or Papyrus, but, well, you can try. If you make it work, then you're going to win some design awards for sure. But just this little thing, explore fonts. Don't go with Inter or Satoshi or Roboto, for God's sake. Try to make things that will stand out a little bit, even if you want to keep it safe in all those other areas. And then, just to kind of sum things up a little bit, I think that the majority of interfaces is still going to be those that I consider boring but functional. And that's good. That's fine. But if we all went, like 100% of us went down that path of just using design systems for everything and having all the apps look exactly the same, then we wouldn't have a lot of the potential innovations, potential delight for the users. And also as designers, like I'm doing this 24 years. If I was doing the same kind of button roundness with the same gradient on it for 24 years, I would kill myself. So we need to push ourselves creatively. Otherwise, it's just going to get boring for us. And if it gets boring for us, it's going to be extremely boring for the users. So I'm going to end with this. If you want to follow my explorations from those case studies, I will be sharing them on Twitter and YouTube. And if you want to check out some of my paid stuff, you can use the code PenpotRocks at Hype4Academy to get a discount. And I'm perfectly on time. Right.
Hi, I'm here.
Hey.
In your experience, what is the role that should accessibility have in a designer's job?
No, it is very important. That's I think in Newmorphism was a very good example of that, where the focus was on just those little cards, and accessibility is not the decorations. For an interface to be accessible, you need all the important elements to be clear and visible. So if the decorations are barely visible and somebody just doesn't see them because of some vision problems, that's going to be fine if the card itself is structured in a way where it doesn't even need that decoration to be understood. So if all the paddings and spacings of everything and all the contrasts there, the buttons, the fonts are good, then that decoration is only like an additional experience. So that should be fine. I'm not for doing Newmorphism, for example, in every possible element, so nobody can then see that. Even people without any vision problems, or people on lower quality displays where some shadows wouldn't render right. So definitely start with the fundamentals first, the stuff that's on top of those cards, and then you can explore the decorations just to see what happens. And if it's not a good idea for an app, don't push it just because it's something different, obviously, but it might just work.
Thank you.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. It was really cool and nice examples. I have a question. I watch you on some videos that you produce. You speak about AI tools and how it can be useful and also how not to use them. And what's your take about finding ideas for making original designs and little tweaks as you mentioned. Is that something that you personally use, AI, to get inspiration for new little adjustments or new little changes to add on your design? Or
All right. Yeah. So for a little bit of context, I'm actually building my own AI tool right now. So I'm exploring these things a little bit myself. And the thing is that we are trying to use AI to generate some interesting results for us. But so far, with a lot of effort and a lot of really smart and creative people building that, I would say all those results are very, very low quality, so they're not usable right now, but AI is progressing very fast, so it might surprise us and generate something useful or something we can maybe transform later into something else, because you don't really need to have a final idea generated. You can have something that, okay, this looks horrible, but if we tweak it a little bit, then maybe it's gonna be nice. Right now, AI is not there, at least not for me, as I feel like it's low-quality content at the moment from most of the AI tools, and there is a lot of also trademark or copyright violations in there as well. So it's a difficult topic. We're trying to build our own model, and our own model at the moment is doing some cool things, but it's not pushing design in a direction where we could actually do something with it yet. So it's building things from already existing patterns. But who knows? I'm curious, as I said, so I will try to explore this strongly and maybe train that AI to actually start generating something like that eventually.
okay.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I'm Dima. The question is about delightful interactions. So do you think you can use delightful interactions in SaaS products or SaaS-like products, right? And if you do you have an idea for delightful interaction for Penpot?
Well, I would have to think about that, but I think that you can add some delight, and even from a perspective of let's say a boring product like YouTube, when you get that very rare 1 out of 10 video, you get a little confetti sprouting out of this little number, and this is also unnecessary. You see the 1, you see the 10, you see the video is doing really well, but it kind of adds this little joy in your heart from a heartless corporation. But of course, delight like that can also go too far, and my opinion, also pretty controversial, is that Duolingo is pushing it way too far. I can't skip half the animations, and by now I've seen them 400-something times, and I close the app before they stop playing because it's just too much. So it's not about adding delight everywhere, adding it, basically piling it on top of each other. It's more about 1 or 2 nice experiences. So yeah, possibly there could be some delight potential in comments, or even checking a comment that you implemented from feedback. Some nice animation can happen there just to kind of, all that hard work paid off. You clicked and confetti.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks for the talk. It's really amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I feel very attached to what you said, especially with the builds playing Quake and designing with Flash. And I just wanted to comment on what you said about design becoming boring. And I think it's a bit related, I don't know, maybe it's a personal thought, on how the medium shapes everything. Marshall McLuhan said that, the medium shapes everything. And I think the reason that we are designing in this way is because of the browser. The browser has been limiting creativity for a really long time, isn't it? Because CSS allows very simple designs. You could do very little things up to recently, isn't it? Like borders, putting a bit of very silly shadows. In fact, we have to have nice shadows, we have to trick the browser. And I think it's a bit of the medium. And as you said, when we had Flash, people became very, very creative because you could do a lot of things with the engine that Macromedia made. And right now, make that type of content is very difficult with a browser if you are not a developer. Isn't it? I think designers cannot express themselves using, I don't know, WebGL because it's very complex. And I think it's a bit related. It's not a question, but it's a bit a thought.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. I think it's actually twofold, because one part is what you said, that there's some technical constraints that are getting better and we'll have more options. And the other thing is the content obsession of the modern era. So like most of the apps are some form of presenting some kind of content. So obviously you can't do too much around that content because the content is what's important. But still, there are areas where you can try to do something. And it doesn't have to be extremely complex code. Sometimes you can even pre-make an animation and just use a GIF or something. So just to explore what you can do and go around. Because I remember back in like the late 90s when you wanted to do a rounded corner button that had a gradient on it, you had to do the middle part and then the two rounded parts. And basically you stretch the middle part and put the two rounded and hope that they're gonna match with the anti-aliasing. So we were going around the limitation of HTML back then as well.
Thanks.
All right. All right.